My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar today, focused on international norms, nuclear taboo, and the risk of use of nuclear weapons. As we know, the norm of the non-use of nuclear weapons really developed after we witnessed the first use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the understanding came to about the power of these weapons, the indiscriminate nature, and the inhumane nature of these weapons. However, in the last several years, particularly in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many parties are asking about whether the nuclear taboo still holds and relevant. How strong is this taboo? And what is the risk of breaking that taboo under the current circumstances? What should international community do to uphold this norm? And what is the future overall of the international nuclear order? We are extremely delighted today to have Dr. Nina Tannenwald with us to speak on this topic. Nina is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at Brown University, but she's currently actually in Vienna. She's a Fulbright visiting professor at the Diplomatic Academy here in Vienna. For those of you who are coming from the academic field, scholarly field, when you mentioned the word nuclear taboo, the name of Dr. Nina Tannenwald immediately comes to mind, because she's actually the author of the book, one of the key readings in our field, The Nuclear Taboo, the United States and the Non-Use of Nuclear Weapons since 1945. She received the book received the 2009 Lepko Prize for the book in international relations. And for those of us who are taking classes studying international relations, nuclear issues, this is one of the mandatory assignments in many of the universities. But she has been very generous in sharing her expertise also with the broader policy community. And we already had a pleasure to have Nina in one of our earlier sessions for one of the courses we offer in the center. But her current work focuses obviously on the international norms and overall the international global order and the control of nuclear weapons and its effectiveness, the human rights and the law of war, how all these areas intersect, and how we can observe the development of this normative structure and of order, and also how the compliance with some of these norms is taking place. So with that introduction, I'm again extremely delighted that Nina, you were able to join us. We'll give floor to Nina for her presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions. But those of you who are following us on Zoom, please use a Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll try to address as many of them in the Q&A session. With that, Nina, it's the greatest pleasure to have you, and we'll look forward to your presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank you and your team here at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation for inviting me to speak today. It's really a pleasure to speak to this audience. So I do have slides, so I'm going to share my slides now. Let's see if that works. Everybody got that?
Yeah, it all works, at least for me.
Okay, great. So my topic today is the nuclear taboo, from the nuclear taboo to the ban treaty. And let's see. More specifically, this is what I will talk about. So first, I want to say a few things about the global nuclear order. Then I'll talk about the origins of the nuclear taboo. And finally, I'll talk about some of the challenges to the nuclear taboo today. So let's begin with the global nuclear order. And I sometimes call this the global nuclear normative order. So I am a political scientist. I'm interested in norms and institutions, especially in security issues. And so I think a lot about norms. So when we think about the global nuclear order, there are two big components. The first is the order between the haves and the have-nots. We could call this maybe the global nuclear order. And so this is centered around the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And the key norms here are non-proliferation and disarmament. The second piece is the order among the 9 nuclear armed states. And this is centered around relationships of deterrence and nuclear stability. And the key norm here is the non-use of nuclear weapons, that is the nuclear taboo. Now, we can look at this in just a bit more detail. So there are 3 key norms of the global nuclear order. I would say they're non-use, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And of course, the non-proliferation regime deals with all of these. But there are other important norms as well. So a norm of no explosive testing centered around the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Peaceful uses, the norm of sharing of peaceful uses of nuclear technology as part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nuclear safety and security. This is about fissile material, the safety and security of fissile material. There are also procedural norms, key procedural norms. These especially have to do with arms control. So reciprocity, this is a very standard norm in international relations, almost everywhere in international relations, but very important in arms control. Transparency is a key norm of arms control, that is being transparent, for example, about nuclear doctrine, about about your stockpile. And stability dialogues is a key procedural norm. That is when nuclear armed states get together and talk about their understandings of deterrence and escalation scenarios, for example. Finally, there are norms that have gone by the wayside. So norms that don't exist anymore, that we have gotten rid of in one way or another. So prohibitions on missile defense, the prohibition on missile defense was the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The United States pulled out of that treaty in 2003. So there are no longer any prohibitions on missile defense. Prohibitions on intermediate range nuclear forces. This was the 1987 INF Treaty, intermediate nuclear range forces. And the Trump administration pulled out of that in 2019. And then more generally, treaty-based arms control is, I think we have a big question mark there. Russia has just announced that it is no longer going to participate in the data exchanges of the New START treaty. So are we looking at the death of treaty-based arms control? So when we look at this picture over all of these 4 categories, and those of you who know this issue pretty well will see that many of these norms are being challenged now. They're eroding. So norms of transparency, for example, are eroding as illustrated by Russia's pulling out of the New START data exchanges. Stability dialogue barely take place anymore. So beyond the norms that have very clearly gone away, many of these other norms are really under stress today. And so I'm going to focus mostly now on the nuclear taboo, but this is the larger picture of the global normative nuclear order. And it's not in very robust shape right now. Okay, the nuclear taboo. So what is the nuclear taboo? It is an international norm of non-use of nuclear weapons, and it is associated with a widespread inhibition on using nuclear weapons first. It's associated with a sense of revulsion about the catastrophic consequences any use of nuclear weapons would likely have. We now have a 77-year tradition of non-use of nuclear weapons. So since the United States first used atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, we now have this 77-year tradition of non-use. And this is interesting because at the time in 1945, after August 1945, many people, especially in the US government and the Defense Department, expected that nuclear weapons would be used again at some point. This would follow the traditional historic patterns that once you have a new weapon, it tends to spread around and it eventually gets used. And instead, we have this tradition of non-use. And that is a really important pattern. It's an interesting puzzle too. So the nuclear taboo emerged during the Cold War, but it was not legalized. It was a de facto international norm. In 2017, the taboo was codified in the Nuclear Ban Treaty. So it is now a legalized, formal, legalized, codified norm. Now, why is the nuclear taboo important? It is the most important norm of nuclear restraint. So I just kind of gave you a picture of various norms of nuclear restraint. This is really the most important one. It reinforces deterrence, right? And deterrence is about, if deterrence works, deterrence is about the non-use of nuclear weapons. And so it reinforces deterrence, that is, if a state is deterred from using nuclear weapons by the threat that the adversary could retaliate if they possess nuclear weapons. And finally, so it reinforces deterrence between mutually nuclear armed states, but it also restrains states even when deterrence doesn't operate. So, for example, in conflicts between nuclear and non-nuclear states, the taboo is really the main restraint there because a non-nuclear state, of course, doesn't possess nuclear weapons and so can't retaliate. So it's the central norm of nuclear restraint in our global nuclear order. Where did the taboo come from? The most important factor was a global grassroots anti-nuclear movement that stigmatized the bomb. So this anti-nuclear movement was composed of civil society, the UN and international organizations, so disarmament politics at the United Nations, non-nuclear states. But there was an important grassroots anti-nuclear element here. And there have been three key periods of grassroots anti-nuclear advocacy. The first was in the 1950s, when anti-nuclear protests were spurred by atmospheric testing. And so the countries were testing in the atmosphere, the US and the Soviet Union, and this was creating radioactive strontium-90 that people were concerned was getting into milk and then into people's bones. And there's kind of a poisoning sort of effect here. And so this gave rise to the first big anti-nuclear protests. So in Britain, in the US, in Japan, and other countries. And these movements basically raised a moral argument. They said nuclear weapons are immoral. We need to ban these weapons. So this was the first big sort of grassroots demands for disarmament. The second period was in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. And this is when the largest grassroots anti-nuclear protests ever emerged. And this was in response to the administration of President Ronald Reagan in the United States, who basically kind of ramped up the Cold War rhetoric and engaged in a significant nuclear arms buildup. And there was a perception that the Reagan administration was very interested in warfighting strategies of nuclear weapons, not simply deterrence, but actually warfighting, that these weapons were usable in some way. And so this led to a big anti-nuclear movement in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere. In 1982, at the UN, about 1 million people protested in New York City, and the nuclear freeze movement arose at this time. The demand to simply that the US and the Soviet Union should simply freeze their nuclear arsenals at current levels. So that was the second big period of an anti-nuclear movement. And the third period is today. And I would say that this began probably, I would date this to April 2009, when President Obama gave his very famous speech in Prague, in which he said that the US bears a moral responsibility, having been the only country to have ever actually used nuclear weapons. The US bears a moral responsibility for taking the lead on nuclear disarmament. And this helped rekindle the disarmament movement. And so in 2010, there was the humanitarian campaign was the first launched at the UN, probably more actively in 2013. And in 2017, this eventually resulted in the nuclear ban treaty, which I will say a little bit more about later. So what did this grassroots anti-nuclear movement do? What was its contribution? And basically, it inserted this sentiment of moral opprobrium into the public debate about nuclear weapons. So it motivated public opinion and educated the public about nuclear weapons, but it really inserted a moral argument into what were otherwise these kind of austere strategic debates about deterrence. Basically, the anti-nuclear movement said nuclear weapons are not just another weapon. And this is the single most important contribution of the disarmament movement, is to make it impossible to think about nuclear weapons as, quote, just another weapon. Right? So the disarmament movement has not been totally successful in achieving disarmament, but it has been successful in stigmatizing nuclear weapons and making it impossible to think about them as just another weapon. Now, as the decades went along, and the US and the Soviet Union acquired the power to totally destroy each other, then superpower self-interest contributed to this development of this non-use norm. So what we call MAD, mutual assured destruction. Right? When you're in a situation of MAD, it's rational to have a norm of non-use, right? If you attack each other with nuclear weapons, that's probably the end of the world. Probably leads to a nuclear war that leads to nuclear catastrophe. So when we think about where this taboo or norm of non-use came from, it's both strategic interests and moral concerns. Now, here is an example from the archive, from the historical archive. So this is President Eisenhower in 1953. And this is what you're seeing here is a discussion from the Eisenhower's National Security Council, where they recognize that a nuclear taboo is emerging in 1953. This is during the Korean War, and at this very end of the Korean War. And they are discussing whether they could use nuclear weapons on China, for example, or in Korea, on the Chinese forces in Korea, if China did not agree to armistice terms. And so here they're saying, this is President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, somehow or other, the taboo which surrounds the use of atomic weapons would have to be destroyed. And then they say, we have got to consider the atomic bomb as just another weapon in our arsenal. So here, what's interesting about this is that they perceive that there is this negative public opinion about nuclear weapons out there. They perceive that there's this emerging taboo out there, and they have to destroy it somehow. Because why? Because it's inhibiting their ability to feel free to use nuclear weapons, right? There's this negative sentiment out there. So they said we have to consider the atomic bomb as just another weapon. And this is precisely what the anti-nuclear movement helped to change. That is, to make it impossible to think about the bomb as just another weapon. Here's a fast forward here to the Vietnam War. So this is a document by the CIA, the US CIA, on the nuclear taboo in 1966. So the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and they are here. This is based on, so this is interesting because the Central Intelligence Agency, as we know, is not an organization particularly respective of norms of various kinds. And so it's interesting here that they are raising the issue of the nuclear taboo. And so they say, if the US used nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War, there would be, quote, a widespread and fundamental revulsion that the US had broken the 20-year taboo on the use of nuclear weapons. And so by this time, there's a 20-year tradition of non-use, and they're saying if the US used nuclear weapons in Vietnam, there would be a really negative world reaction, and they use the language of the nuclear taboo. Now, I should say that the US did not seriously consider use of nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War. So it wasn't like the US was close to doing this. Some generals had some war plan, but this was not a situation where the US was seriously considered using nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, the CIA is doing its intelligence analysis and looks into this matter, and this is their conclusion. Fast forward to the present. So today we have the Ukraine war, and I have to say that since the Ukraine war began, I have never been more worried about the use of nuclear weapons than I have been in my entire professional career of thinking and writing about nuclear weapons. So we are, during this war, I think we are coming closer to the use of nuclear weapons, or we have come closer to the use of nuclear weapons than any time probably since maybe 1983, but the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So as we all know, Russia has shielded its invasion of Ukraine with nuclear threats. This is not the first time that a country that possesses nuclear weapons has invaded a non-nuclear state. So the United States invaded Vietnam and Iraq. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. What's different here is the very explicit use of nuclear threats to keep NATO and the West from aiding Ukraine. And these nuclear threats have come every few days, especially at the beginning of the war. Every few days, a Russian government official has issued some kind of threat. That is new and different. It's been very damaging for the taboo because it suggests both that the use of nuclear weapons is legitimate and in a war like this, not to mention, in any war, but in a war like this, and it normalizes nuclear weapons by suggesting that they are legitimate and usable weapons. So this kind of loose talk is really very damaging for the taboo. Now, the world's response to this has been quite strong in my view. So the world's response to Russia's nuclear threats has played a crucial role in reinforcing the taboo. So the taboo has held so far, and it's also salient that people are leaders, countries around the world, but especially important friends of Russia like China and India have made it clear that use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable in this war, unacceptable in general. Western leaders, President Biden and other Western leaders have made it clear that use of nuclear weapons would be unacceptable. The UN Secretary General has said this is unacceptable. The G20, have said nuclear threats are unacceptable. So there's been lots of public talk about the unacceptability of nuclear threats. And so I think, and using the language of the nuclear taboo, and it's not only government leaders, but of course we've seen lots of newspaper articles and journal articles. And so the taboo is salient and it does continue to hold. So I think that the pushback we're seeing has been important in upholding the taboo in the face of Putin's threats. I should say, however, that Russia is not the only party engaged in irresponsible talk about using nuclear weapons. So we have Kim Jong-un, we have Trump. We remember those days in 2018 when these two leaders were exchanging nuclear threats on Twitter and calling each other names. More recently, North Korea basically deploys nuclear threats on a fairly regular basis in response to what it perceives as U.S. nuclear threats against it, U.S. nuclear rhetoric, but also capabilities, exercises that the United States engages in with North Korea. So Kim Jong-un is probably the leader who, after Putin has engaged in nuclear threats on a somewhat regular basis. But again, he is not the only one. More recently, we have learned that this is a book that came out recently in 2023 that Trump actually discussed a nuclear strike on North Korea and asked his advisors, we have all these nuclear weapons, how come we can't use them? So, and his advisors had to sort of talk to him about why this probably wouldn't be very useful. But India and Pakistan have also engaged in nuclear threats as well, and irresponsible talk about nuclear weapons. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi, basically in 2019, when this is when kind of the rhetoric between India and Pakistan heated up, and the Pulwama crisis basically said, well, Modi says, why do we have these nuclear weapons? They're there to be used, and we aren't going to be afraid of using them against Pakistan. Again, very, very irresponsible. This is part of playing to a Hindu nationalist base. So it's a lot of it is about domestic politics, but nevertheless, it is, again, this kind of rhetoric that normalizes nuclear weapons. And Pakistan has returned the favor. So Pakistani ministers, and this is just one example, again, talk very loosely about using nuclear weapons against India. And before the Ukraine war, in my view, the India-Pakistan relationship, nuclear relationship, was the most dangerous in terms of the kind of perceived willingness of these two countries to engage in both rhetoric, but also irresponsible behavior during various crises that they've had. Whoops, forward. So this brings us to the nuclear ban treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this treaty was adopted on July 7th, 2017. It entered into force in January 2021. And with this treaty, the nuclear taboo became a legal prohibition. So it's now written into this treaty. And so in Article 1, it says that one of the things that is prohibited here, it says each state party undertakes never under any circumstances to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. So that's a prohibition both on the actual use of nuclear weapons, but also on the threat of use of nuclear weapons, which means also a deterrent threat is prohibited under the treaty. So this now gives the taboo, which has been a de facto norm, a legalized institutional home. So how do we strengthen this taboo in the future? And how do we go forward from here? So first, I think the ban treaty will play a key role, and this is in part because it gives the taboo an institutional home. So there are now, I believe, 92 signatories to the treaty and 68 parties. There will be regular meetings of the states party to the treaty, and they will talk about the taboo and non-use. So the advocates of the ban treaty have very explicitly talked about that one goal of the ban treaty was to codify the nuclear taboo, and now it does that. So we know from social science that norms that are embedded in institutions are more robust, right? And harder to dismantle, a little bit more difficult to erode. It's not that it can't happen, but when norms are embedded in institutions, they tend to have more staying power. And so it's important that the taboo is now legalized. Continued stigmatization of nuclear weapons is essential. Now, this is very much what the ban treaty does. In my view, not everybody's view, but in my view, its primary contribution is as a stigmatization treaty. In my view, it's not primarily a disarmament treaty. It's not going to lead, certainly not tomorrow, it's not going to lead the nuclear armed states to disarm. And even ban treaty supporters and advocates understand that a disarmament treaty needs to be bigger, longer, more detailed, have verification provisions, and so on. So, but its primary function now in the immediate term is as a stigmatization treaty. And the continued stigmatization of nuclear weapons is absolutely essential. And so things that tend to undo that stigmatization or to unroll it, to roll it backward, we want to avoid. So things like very small nuclear weapons that seem more usable, dual capability weapons, so cruise missiles where you might host either a conventional or a nuclear warhead, those things fudge the distinction, they fudge the line, what should be a very clear line between nuclear and conventional weapons, and they help undermine that stigmatization. So loose talk about nuclear weapons, of course, discourse is very important. So these kinds of things, the continued stigmatization is very important. World leaders should continue to publicly reaffirm commitment to the taboo. I call this taboo talk. And world leaders should get up and talk about the taboo. And they should, for example, the restatement of the Reagan-Gorbachev statement that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. That's a very important statement. So the P5 reaffirmed that in January 2022. But that could be affirmed again, that could be reaffirmed. India and Pakistan should affirm that. Journalists should ask their leaders, should ask government officials about this. Right? Should put leaders and officials on the spot and make them talk about this. So in my view, discourse is very important. What are the places we have to start when we're trying to shore up norms, uphold norms, even and create new norms? But there also should be continue what we're seeing, which is very explicit condemnations of nuclear threats and condemnations of any threat to use and nuclear threats in general. And finally, more generally, and this is for the nuclear armed states themselves, as well as the rest of the world, but the nuclear armed states do need to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their security policies. And of course, all of this needs to be a step on the way to pursuing a world free of nuclear weapons. So let me stop there. And I'm looking forward to all your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, very much for that incursion into the history of the taboo and what it means today and how the norm developed and continues to develop. I do have myself a couple of follow-up questions, if you allow me. and then we'll move to the questions that are appearing in the Q&A.
Absolutely. Should I stop my screen sharing? Would that be useful?
I think that would be probably very useful.
How's that?
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I have several questions to you. First of all, I wanted to, obviously the war in Ukraine is on everybody's mind, particularly because these very, sometimes people say unveiled, but veiled threats, but it was clear what Putin have been signaling about at the beginning of the war, and it continues even nowadays. All the rhetoric became a little much more reserved in this space. And people were, at the beginning, were discussing possible scenarios of the use of nuclear weapons, the tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine and things like that. Looks like we stepped a little bit back from that stage. But nonetheless, I'm really concerned about this loose talk. And you also mentioned Trump and Kim Jong-un and possibly some others. Why is it even became possible nowadays to resort to this kind of exchanges of rhetoric? Is that because we became a little bit numb after the end of the Cold War? Why the leaders are actually allowing themselves this loose talk? Because it wasn't the case. Maybe we had these situations, the Cuban crisis, maybe some other case, but it has never been that used in a passing by, basically. Whatever the threat comes up, okay, we have a big nuclear button and our button is bigger than yours. This is extremely disconcerting. And also the role of the civil society nowadays. I know that the civil society, non-governmental organizations played a huge role in both pushing for the negotiations of the nuclear ban treaty and including participating in the and working with the different states through the negotiation process. But still, my expectation was when this, particularly with the war in Ukraine, Russia's threats were coming out, that there will be a much broader civil society response to it. And maybe even, you know, I'm not talking about 1 million people marches, but at least some visible movement in this area. And I don't see it. How do you explain that?
Great question. Thank you. So why all the loose talk? So there are a number of pieces of this. So the first element is the rise of populist nationalist leaders. So you look at who is making the nuclear threats. Trump, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Modi. These are what we call in political science populist nationalists, right? They're playing to a base, kind of fundamentalist base. They're populist. They have a discourse about how they, you know, the globalists, the international community. There's a lot of things they have in common. They don't like international law. They don't like the sort of globalists. They don't like to be restrained. And they like to wave about their powerful weapons. And, you know, initially it was really just with Kim Jong-un who resorted to nuclear threats. And then Trump came in and really, you know, took it to a new level of outrageous with his tweets. And so I think one important factor is these new kinds of populist leaders who most of them don't care several of them are not democracies at all, and Modi and Trump don't care very much about democratic norms at all. Right? So that's one factor, the type of leaders who are making these nuclear threats. Second is an element what I would call nuclear forgetting. And I think you're right. I think that until now, the current generation has sort of forgotten about nuclear weapons and the Cold War. So in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended in the 1990s, there was sort of this period of euphoria and this kind of thought that, well, yeah, nuclear weapons exist, but they're not very relevant to all these current issues. It's UN peacekeeping now and development in the global south, and we don't have to think so much about nuclear weapons. And I think they really receded from the sort of list of priorities, and people have forgotten the kind of sort of the Cold War tensions, and so now they're coming back. And I have to say, when I look at some of the debates around how much the West, what kind of equipment, what kind of firepower the US can provide to Ukraine, I'm very worried about the risk of nuclear escalation. And I have to say, I'm really stunned by some of the people who, in my view, should know better, who are advocating total victory for Ukraine. Let's give Ukraine everything at once, take back Crimea, right? I mean, these tend to be ex-generals and ex-NATO officials, people who are not in positions of government responsibility right now. But I have to say, I'm really struck by people who have forgotten what it's like to live under this, to live in a situation where you're actually deterred by the other side's nuclear weapons. I mean, the West, unfortunately, is deterred by Russia's nuclear arsenal. So I find an element of nuclear forgetting, not just among the population, among civil society, but among government officials or analysts who should know better. And I should say, just at my university, we didn't teach any courses on nuclear weapons up until a few years ago. Students in my university were interested in the environment, in climate change, in saving the global south. They weren't interested in nuclear weapons. And now we teach nuclear weapons politics classes again, and there's some students who are interested. But this brings me to your third question about what's the role of civil society. I mean, I do not see, you're right, I totally agree. Civil society organizations played a key role in helping achieve the ban treaty, no question about that. But it's still fairly narrow group. It is not a grassroots, really broad-based grassroots movement like we saw in the 1980s. It's not a lot of students on campus and campuses. Climate change is really the dominant issue, and nuclear weapons are not. And so I think that's partly why we haven't seen more progress on disarmament, is because we don't have that pressure on key governments who have to do disarmament. So it would be, for example, the United States. There is not that civil society pressure on the US government to pursue disarmament. And therefore we're not getting that, we're not seeing very much progress. One more comment on the civil society issue, which is that unfortunately in the wake of the Ukraine war, we're seeing public opinion go the other way. So the public opinion polls that have come out now on Europe, for example, show increasing support for nuclear deterrence rather than reduced. I mean, people are still in favor of disarmament, but there's also more support for deterrence now. That's one of the effects of the war. Oh, I can't hear you, Elena. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Nina. I have a million other questions, but I need to make sure I also take the questions from our viewers and audience. And I'm going to read a couple of questions. I have some really good ones. From Anonymous, that indeed, does nuclear signaling for political rather than military purposes erode the nuclear taboo? It seems that nuclear threats that may be regarded as empty threats or bluffs do not receive enough censure from the international communities as should. Does this mean it does not really affect the nuclear taboo?
Great question. So I think you're right. I think nuclear signaling that basically says we mean business does erode the taboo. And that's because discourse matters. How people talk about things and about nuclear weapons matters. So of course we're debating, is Putin really serious with his nuclear threats? I mean, we know that the nuclear threats are directed at keeping NATO and the West out of the war. Beyond that, do we think Putin would really use a nuclear weapon? We don't know. Right? We don't know what's in Putin's head. So is this signaling just, political? Putin means business. He's serious about this war. He wants to keep NATO out. Even just the political signaling, in my view, does erode the taboo, because it suggests again that we can use this horribly destructive weapon in a kind of casual manner and signal that well, we might use them. We could think about it, right? When they should really be, it should be much more unacceptable to do that. So I think even the political threats are unacceptable.
No, thank you. I agree with that. I'm going to probably focus, combine several questions related to the TPNW, and I'll list them one by one, and we'll see if maybe you can take a note. One of them relates to the status of the that now it's a legal norm and it's international law norm, but there is, because nuclear weapon states and alliance states are not parties of this treaty. How do you see the statements that the treaty is not a customary law and the countries are not abided by it, and that because these countries are never going to join it and actively oppose, that it may never actually become a customary international law norm? So that's one layer of it. The second layer of the questions related to the TPNW is about the meeting last year, when there was a first meeting of state parties of the TPNW, and there was a lot of discussion whether to condemn the threats that Russia was issuing at that time, nuclear threats. And in the end, the declaration settles on the language that condemns threats by all states. Then the similar discussion was in the NPT review conference. So how do you see that situation, and how important it is whether we should name the names, or we need to pursue that it's for everyone and no one is exempt from these norms?
Great questions, thank you. So the status of the ban treaty, will it become customary law? I mean, so what status does it have? All right, so legally it's only binding on the parties that joined it. If, for example, it gets up over 100 ratifications, for example, I mean, I would view that as pretty weighty statement in international affairs, right? I mean, that's pretty significant for a treaty. And so I do think that numbers is important for the treaty, that the more states you can get to join, the better in terms of establishing a norm. Now, one thing we know is that treaties do have spillover effects. So you create a norm that's binding on the parties, but can still have spillover effects on the behavior of other countries. So the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, for example, has spillover effects, and the landmines ban has spillover effects. So we know that, for example, the United States has changed its behavior, even though it's not a party to the convention. And so there can be these spillover effects even on the non-parties. And so that we will look and see if is that going to happen? How likely is that in this case? What will we be looking for? Whether it becomes customary law or not, here the lawyers debate and reasonable people disagree about this, but probably most uses of nuclear weapons would violate international humanitarian law. There are a very small number of cases where the nuclear armed states have said, well, here's a situation where you have no collateral damage. So if you used a nuclear weapon on a ship at sea, right, and no civilians were killed, right, would that violate international humanitarian law? Probably not. But the problem is that's not really one of the scenarios in the state's nuclear war plan. So it's not very realistic. But nevertheless, we're talking, I think at this point, most uses of nuclear weapons that we can reasonably imagine probably violate the laws of war. And so the points of debate are fairly narrow range of issues at this point. But I think from the technical perspective, if you have these persistent, the persistent rejectors, right? The states who regularly make statements that this is not customary law and they don't intend to abide by it and it doesn't bind them, as the nuclear armed states say. They can, that's their strong effort to make sure that customary law doesn't come into existence around this treaty, and any judges looking at that would have to take that into account. The threats, all right, so the threats, the statement about threats in the outcome document of the first meeting of the state parties. So as many of you know, there's a disagreement among parties about whether one should single out the very explicit nuclear threats of a country like Russia in the Ukraine war, or whether in the vision of the ban treaty, of course, all nuclear threats, threats based on a policy or practice of nuclear deterrence, are now illegitimate. They're now illegal. I get the point there. However, I think it would be a mistake to erase the distinction between very explicit nuclear threats used during an illegal invasion, or in any other case, very explicit nuclear threats, articulated nuclear threats to actually use nuclear weapons on another country, and the kind of background policies of nuclear deterrence. I think we all have sophisticated enough language that we can make that distinction in our public statements and our speeches and so on. That's an analytical distinction. I think it's really important to make and not to erase. And I think it's still possible to condemn and stigmatize the policy, the general policy of nuclear deterrence, while also saying, look, what Russia's doing, and if any other country did that, that would also be equally unacceptable. Right? So, we don't want to erase important analytical distinctions. That would be my view. And yes, I think we should name names.
Yeah, we certainly are doing it today, but I'm gonna focus on deterrence and other policies related to nuclear weapons at the moment. Well, first of all, to the no first use of nuclear weapons. How much is that part of the nuclear taboo? Whether this makes the nuclear taboo stronger. And also from what we see, it seems like we're walking back from countries willing, or even those who have had the no first use. We're kind of walking back in that direction. That is one question. The other question that one of our participants asked is from Tom Zauer, about what you said about the nuclear taboo reinforces nuclear deterrence. When he says that this is only the case when nuclear deterrence means no use, but nuclear deterrence is more. It implies the use if needed. So the taboo, in my view, in his view, undermines, not reinforces nuclear deterrence. Also, the TPNW that legalizes the taboo explicitly prohibits nuclear deterrence. So how do you answer that question? So first, no use, and then the relationship between the nuclear taboo and nuclear deterrence.
Mhm. Yep. Great, more great questions. So let's see, no first use. Yes, so no first use and the taboo are very much related. So the nuclear taboo, as I have written about it, is a norm of no first use. I have not made big claims about second use, right? If a nuclear weapon was used against you, there's in traditional international law, there's a sense that a reciprocal response is acceptable, is legal, right? Reciprocity. I actually think today that the taboo, if you're trying to uphold the taboo, might even apply to second use as well. And you can see this in the way the Biden administration has responded to Putin's threats of nuclear use. So the contingency, the U.S. contingency planning, I mean, we don't know exactly what it is, but what we can discern from the public discussions is that the Biden administration has planned a conventional response. Contingency planning is if Putin used nuclear weapons, a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, the Biden administration's response would be to use an all-out, an overwhelming conventional strike, not to retaliate with nuclear weapons. And why would you do that? Because if you're trying to stigmatize a weapon, you don't want to use the same weapon that you're trying to stigmatize. It's a parallel with chemical weapons. Right? If Putin used chemical weapons or any country used chemical weapons, we wouldn't respond with chemical use because we want to stigmatize those weapons. So the taboo is essentially a norm of no first use. And China and India both have no first use policies now. People say, well, these policies aren't meaningful because you can immediately, in any crisis, you can immediately set it aside. And of course you can, right? They don't necessarily prevent you from actually launching a nuclear weapon first. What they do, if they're meaningful, a no first use policy is meaningful, is that you want it built into your operational doctrine. That is, you want your nuclear forces structured in a way that they can't engage in an all-out nuclear first strike where you try to wipe out the adversary's entire nuclear arsenal. And if you had all nuclear forces structured that way, no launch on warning, those kinds of things, then the crisis stability would be much stronger. So I do think no first use is very important. In my view, one way of strengthening the nuclear taboo would be to move toward no first use policies for all nuclear armed states. I also think because China and India both have no first use policies right now, people raise questions about how serious they are, but nevertheless, they do exist and they haven't abandoned them. That these are we could uphold sort of the leadership of India and China on this no first use issue in a way that wouldn't always be the United States or the Western powers doing something, but here is something that India and China could take the lead on in promoting this no first use policy more widely. Are we walking backward on it? I think in some ways, yes. Biden's nuclear posture review, Biden in the past has come out and made public statements about how he believes that the sole purpose of US nuclear weapons is to retaliate for a use of nuclear weapons against the United States first. That is not in the US nuclear posture review now. A lot of this has to do with the rising geopolitical tensions and the nuclear modernization that we all know about. So I think it seems like we are farther from no first use policies right now than we have been at times in the past. But like many things, I think these are areas where things are going backwards. at the moment. Tom Sauer, nuclear taboo reinforces deterrence. So yeah, so the two deterrence is a very rational, right? Sort of you're in sort of deterrence theory, you're rationally deterred from using nuclear weapons because of the overwhelming destruction that a retaliatory nuclear strike on your country would cause. The taboo raises normative costs, right? So if you used it, and the normative costs are things like reputation, how using a nuclear weapon would affect your reputation, public opinion, the moral costs. And why do I think it reinforces the taboo? Because of what I found in the historical record. When, I've been through most of the decision-making by the United States only, but most of the decision-making that US leaders engaged in when they thought about using nuclear weapons, and in various crises during the Cold War and after. And it was clear first that deterrence, they were deterred, so deterrence does work. That you could see them concerned about escalation and retaliation, and what they used a nuclear weapon, where would it go? But you also see a lot of discussion about the reputation. If we used a nuclear weapon, we would lose all of public opinion in the third world, and political costs, moral costs, the moral opprobrium, like you saw in the CIA document that I showed you, right? They actually talked about this stuff, and it reinforced their inclination not to use nuclear weapons. So the taboo, it's a normative, it imposes potential normative costs, not just physical material costs, but normative costs in any country that might use nuclear weapons. And we could see this for Putin now, right? If Putin used a nuclear weapon, there'd be a lot of normative costs for Russia.
Thank you, Nina. The questions keep coming in. Very good one. But I'm afraid we won't be able to address all of them. But a lot of it may be less theoretical question, but also some that makes people worry about some of these threats, and people are thinking about how they can cope with this or make plan Bs in case of the use. And there is a kind of a talk about the billionaire bunkers that they built, and that there are perceptions that the nuclear war we can survive a nuclear war, at least for some. I know that there have been even investments to studies about how do, for example, we develop seeds that can thrive in the post-nuclear apocalypse time and grow in radiation. What do you say to those people?
Oh, so I mean, it's so depressing. So, a couple of thoughts. One is that I would make a distinction between what you do privately, or what governments do privately, or what they do in terms of contingency planning, and what you do publicly. So publicly, I think that the first response to any talk about nuclear use should be, this is unacceptable. This is completely unacceptable. Anybody who talks about this, anybody who thinks about this, this is completely unacceptable for anybody. Like, that has to be the first response. And of course, governments have to do contingency planning. That's one job of government. And the US military, for example, and European militaries have to think about, they have to have some contingency plans. What if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, then what? What if India and Pakistan use nuclear weapons against each other, then what? So there has to be contingency planning, but this, this should take place not as part of public discourse, in my view, because again, it suggests, sort of going that we've accepted this, right? And I think our first line always has to be, this is completely unacceptable. I have been very troubled by all the newspaper articles that came out, especially last spring and last fall, would Putin really use a nuclear weapon? And, what would we do? What are the scenarios? And what would we do if Putin used a nuclear weapon? I mean, these are really important questions for governments, for example. But so then you have these articles working through all the scenarios and the different ways the US and the West might respond. And, to me, this is, again, it's kind of legitimizing all of this. And I think I'm worried that there was kind of a goading effect at some point. Putin isn't man enough to use a nuclear weapon here. A whole year has gone by and he's made threats to use nukes, but he hasn't actually used them yet. What is he, not man enough, not tough enough? That's not the kind of message we want to send. So, how do we deal with the aftermath of nuclear war? It's a terrible question to have to think about. And, I do think responsible government agencies do have to think about this, but this is something they do in the background, and maybe some think tanks do it quietly, but this is not what should be up as part of the main political debate, in my view.
Thank you, Nina. That's a difficult question to think about. I'm going to, again, combine a couple of questions that are coming from several people in our audience about the situation where we, for example, didn't have nuclear weapons. And if you think about the war in Ukraine, if Russia did not have nuclear weapons, this could have been a different scenario, and that the nuclear intimidation plays a big role in the way this conflict is evolving. But also a broader question, there have been a number, particularly those who are proponents of deterrence, says like, if you remove nuclear weapons now, before you know it, we will be in all-out conventional war. So how do you respond to some of these discussions and statements?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I think when you look at the Ukraine war, the major lesson from the war is that Russia has benefited from nuclear weapons. And they've used the nuclear threat to shield this conventional invasion. If there were no nuclear weapons, the West could use its overwhelming conventional superiority to win the war much faster. I think the West would defeat Russia much more quickly. So the effect of nuclear weapons is that the war is going to go on much longer and more people are going to be killed. Because the West has to be restrained in how much firepower it's going to provide to Ukraine, and it can't enter the war on Ukraine's behalf. So I think that's one of the major downsides of nuclear weapons that we're seeing in this war. So, the West is deterred from providing greater firepower from entering the war. On the other side, Russia is deterred from expanding the war, deterred by NATO's nuclear weapons from expanding the war to, say, Romania or Poland. So deterrence is working, but of course it comes at great cost, and there's significant downside. So one of the lessons, I think, from this war for about nuclear weapons is that, yes, they do provide some protection, but the scope of protection is limited. And basically it means that Ukraine has to struggle on significantly by itself. But I do think it means the war will go on longer, and more people will be killed because of Russia's nuclear arsenal. If we got rid of nuclear weapons, then it would open the door for major conventional war. I think that's correct. Unfortunately, I'm not worried that we're going to, for better or worse, get rid of nuclear weapons anytime soon. Presumably in a world moving toward nuclear disarmament, the world itself would have to be a little different than the world we have now. And so it's not going to be the current world with no nuclear weapons. It's going to be a world that has a lot more normative and institutional restraints. In my view, personally, I would be okay with a world of very small number of nuclear weapons and very strong norms. If we got to that point, you know, I'd be okay with that. I think that would be a pretty important accomplishment.
Thank you, Nina. And that's actually a good segue to my next question, since we started talking about disarmament and potentially going down to the lower numbers. But what we usually hear from the nuclear weapon states in different international fora negotiations, that they reaffirm their commitment to the goal of nuclear disarmament. So you won't hear any of the nuclear weapon states as like, no, we oppose disarmament and would never do. But they also very strongly oppose the stigmatization of nuclear weapons and possession as well, because the TPNW also prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons. Do you think disarmament is possible without this stigmatization?
I mean, I would say no, right? The stigmatization is an essential part of making these weapons unusable. So you can have lower numbers. I mean, I think that we could get to lower numbers. That would certainly be possible, but stigmatization is part of the, is how we make nuclear weapons unacceptable. Right? If they weren't stigmatized at all and they were a weapon just like just another weapon, I think we would have seen more use of nuclear weapons. So the stigmatization is key. I think a key part of the package of normative restraints, and that's why I think the ban treaty is important, right? Because it provides an institutional home for stigmatization politics. It's not necessarily going to get the nuclear armed states to disarm tomorrow, but it provides that basis for stigmatization politics. You're going to have annual meetings every year and states talking about the ban treaty, and right, that's stigmatization politics. It's what we call agenda politics in political science, right? You put the issue on the agenda and then you have to deal with it, and the nuclear armed states have to respond. So I think these things go hand in hand.
Thank you, Nina, for that. They're very good questions that it's just impossible to fit into our short time. But maybe I'll ask one last question before we close our webinar today. And that is, you already talked about the impact of the war in Ukraine on the nuclear taboo first, and also on the nuclear normative order overall. There's a few things you've already highlighted, but what else you are kind of monitoring and watching in terms of the impact of that nuclear rhetoric and the situation that we still kind of in a deterrence work to some degree. What else you see as the impact, both on the norms, but also on the understanding of these norms?
Yeah, so I mean, the downside is that deterrence is being, has a new salience. It's I think being, in some ways, deterrence itself is being re-legitimized. And so you can just look at things like Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and shifts in public opinion that in countries like Germany, which were toying with the ban treaty and no first use, and now where support for nuclear deterrence is going up. And so I think in all the nuclear armed states, we're seeing modernization programs, spending billions of dollars and money on revitalizing and modernizing nuclear arsenals. Some nuclear doctrines, I think, are going backward from the perspective of the nuclear taboo. I mean, Pakistan is an example where it's talking about battlefield nuclear weapons. I mean, these are things that that went out of fashion in the 1980s, and now they're kind of coming back, and all this talk about tactical nuclear weapons. Again, is there such thing as a limited use of a nuclear weapon? Could you really have a limited nuclear war and use a so-called tactical nuclear weapon and that wouldn't somehow escalate to a major nuclear exchange? So I think lots of things are going backward. On top of that, I think one effect of the Ukraine war, especially certainly in Europe, is going to be massively increased defense spending, right? So, I mean, one of the conclusions, you're a European country, one of the conclusions you might draw from the Ukraine war is that better to spend your money on conventional weapons that are usable than nuclear weapons that are really not usable. Nevertheless, what I think we're going to see is more spending on both on nuclear arsenals and on conventional weapons. So in general, I think the big outcome of the Ukraine war is more militarization of policies, foreign policies.
Thank you, Nina, for taking that question. But I don't want us to end on this note, negative note. What gives you hope that we first of all the taboo would hold, and how we can move forward to not only reinforcing it but actually moving towards the reducing at least the nuclear weapons, or reducing the reliance on nuclear weapons.
Right. Great. So how do we find a silver lining in all this? I agree. I get to the end of my teaching semesters with my students and I think, oh my God, I've just taught a like totally depressing class. But so I think, there's a couple things. One is what I did talk about in my talk, which is that the global response to Putin's nuclear threats has been pretty good. It's been pretty, I think it's been pretty strong. And it does, I think people are shocked by these nuclear threats, and they realize that perhaps we have taken some of these things a little too casually, and that there is too much nuclear forgetting, and that we need to do much more to remind ourselves what a catastrophe nuclear use could bring. And so, this is now back on the front burner rather than the back burner. I think the response to Putin has shored up the nuclear taboo. I think this is sort of reinvigorated it. So it's signaled to the world that everybody thinks this is important. But we need to do much more in the way of nuclear education. So the public needs to be much more educated about nuclear weapons and about their consequences. And so when I said that governments should do their contingency planning privately, I didn't mean that we shouldn't talk about the consequences of nuclear weapons and nuclear use. And that's certainly one of the things that the ban campaign, the humanitarian campaign, has done and tried to do is to educate people about what the actual consequences would be if you use nuclear weapons, and what resources do states and communities have in a real kind of realistic scenario to respond to these things. And of course, the answer is, it would be really catastrophic, it would be really terrible, and we really don't have the capability to respond to the humanitarian crisis that would be caused. I think those kinds of things are important, and so we do need to educate publics around the world about the risks and costs of nuclear deterrence and maintaining nuclear weapons, and that would be kind of the message going forward.
Thank you, Nina. I fully subscribe to your message in terms of the need to educate the public and actually continue the discussions and probably even more vocal than before about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and their use. But we already went over time a little bit. Thank you for joining us today, Nina. That was a fabulous overview and very difficult and interesting questions, and appreciate your responses to them. My apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to answering. There were way too many of them. I tried to cram them into shorter questions, but apparently didn't work. So hopefully we'll have another chance to discuss these issues in our seminars, webinars, and hopefully we'll have Nina back you to our audience at some point again. But with that, I want everybody to join me in thanking Dr. Nina Tannenwald, and also wish everybody a really nice day, morning, evening, depending on where you are tuning in.